but this is a topic that we really felt that we had to do something to at least begin to start having a conversation to better help us understand what has just recently taken place in Zimbabwe, and then what some of the prospects for future political and economic developments in Zimbabwe might be like. So we've put together this panel entitled Prospects for Real Change in Zimbabwe, a panel discussion on recent developments. I'm very pleased to invite and to have here at Howard with us three panelists, all from Zimbabwe. To my immediate left is Mr. Den Moyo, who is the MD Movement for Democratic Change representative here in the United States. To his left is Dr. Frenk Guni, who is an independent analyst but also member of ZANU-PF, which is the ruling political party in Zimbabwe. And then to his left is Mr. Calvin Maduna, who is a PhD student in our Department of African Studies here at Howard University. And so I also want to, of course, just acknowledge the Department of African Studies for helping to organize this. Wheeler Winstead, the Assistant Director of the Center for African Studies, and then, of course, Calvin Maduna, who was instrumental in really prompting me to make sure that we had an event on Zimbabwe before we broke for Christmas break. So we also are hoping to be able to connect to South Africa. We have a long time but since retired colleague here at Howard, Dr. John Trimble, who is spent a lot of time in Zimbabwe, but is now actually living in South Africa for the past 3 or 4 years. We're hoping to connect him via Skype or Zoom, one of those media, so that he can contribute to the conversation as well. I thought, for the sake of the students, I might quickly just recap. It's very hard to do this, and I'm going to try and not butcher Zimbabwe's history, but I think it's important to have a little bit of an understanding of some of the benchmarks that have led up to where it is, where we are today in Zimbabwe. So I will do that, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists to really give us their sense and their understanding of what were the immediate events that led up to the political change that recently occurred in Zimbabwe, and then their take on what we can anticipate in the next coming months, but then also in the next coming years for Zimbabwe, what they think that this will mean for Zimbabwe. So just to quickly try and give my students a bit of an understanding of the layout in Zimbabwe. And what we're talking about. So the recent developments that we're talking about is on the evening of November 14th, the Zimbabwe military seized control of the capital of Zimbabwe, Harare, and put the president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, under house arrest. This, caught the attention of the international community. Is this a coup? What's going on? Blah, blah, blah. And we can debate, I'm sure we might debate whether or not we do actually call this a coup attempt. But what actually ended up happening over the course of the next week is the military insisted this was not a coup, that President Mugabe was still in power. But in effect, what ended up happening was 1 week later, on November 21st, Robert Mugabe resigned from president of Zimbabwe, and he was succeeded by Emerson Mnangagwa, who used to be his vice president of the country, but had been fired by Mugabe. Is it over? That's right. It was only just a few weeks before that, so it wasn't even a month before that. So a little bit of a political kind of soap opera is, you'll probably hear a little bit more about that. But that's the events that happened in November, which kind of, brought caught the eye of the international community. Why this is so important is because Robert Mugabe should be a name that all of you are familiar with, because he was the leader of Zimbabwe since its independence in 1980. So he's been in power for 37 years, right? But his reign has been kind of interesting because it's not a straightforward, story of an African dictator. And so to give you just kind of a little bit of that background, without going into too much detail, Zimbabwe gained its independence in 1980, and if you know its history, it was a white settler colony, which means that at the time of its independence, you had a significant, certainly not a majority, a small minority, but you had a significant population of white Rhodesians, as they call themselves, who wanted to stay in power and remain in power. Okay, and so Zimbabwe was one of the countries that had to fight an armed struggle to basically gain its independence. Right, the whites were not going to give up power easily. And one of the consequences of that armed struggle and the consequences of really what ended up being a negotiated settlement was the Lancaster House Agreement. And two important components of the Lancaster House Agreement, which was negotiated by Britain, which was the former colony or colonizer in Zimbabwe, was one was political, one was economic. So the political one was that the Lancaster House Agreement gave a certain number, and actually a large percentage, I think it was 20% of the seats in Parliament to the whites, who only comprised 4% of the population. Is a small percentage of the population, right? But they were granted 20% of the seats. The second was more. The second one was equally consequential in that it insisted that the incoming government, black government of Zimbabwe, could not reappropriate the land from the white Rhodesian farmers, the white Rhodesian settlers. And they would only be able to buy back the land on a willing buyer, willing seller arrangement. And so what that meant was that actually for the first 20 years of Zimbabwe's independence, very little land reform actually ended up taking place, right? For a variety of reasons. I can't get into all of those now. So that was the kind of context of independence. And what's also important to know is that really Mugabe came in seen as very much a liberator and somebody who had the full backing and support of the international community, right? We thought that he was doing a good job. You saw tremendous strides in terms of improvements in access to healthcare, education, the economy was doing well. And by and large, Mugabe was following, the recommendations of the international community in terms of its economic policies, in terms of not appropriating the land of the white settlers, et cetera, et cetera. So things were from the international perspective, seemed to be doing well for the first 20 years. Okay, but there was always this underlying issue of land, right, which remains very germane. In the region, I was going to say South Africa, which it does as well, in the region, but especially in Zimbabwe. And so that continued to rear its ugly head. Just to, again, lots going on here, but let me just fast forward to 2000, which is a pivotal year, because that was a year where Mugabe proposed, and his administration proposed a referendum on two things. First, he wanted to extend his term in office, so he was looking to do what a number of African leaders have done, to allow him to be president for a longer period of time. And then secondly, he in order to kind of gain favor with a number of constituents which were becoming more and more vocal within his own society, he proposed a referendum or an amendment that would allow him to basically seize land from the white farmers. The referendum was actually denied. It did not pass. By a very slim majority. It did not pass. But that was a pivotal year because that was the year in which, just before this referendum, opposition movements and political parties like the Movement for Democratic Change were formed, and there was a lot more political mobilization and opposition towards Mugabe and towards the political direction and economic direction that the country was taking. So just to kind of quickly recap, some of the constituents that were really mobilizing at this time were the veterans of the liberation movement, who are very influential in Zimbabwe. Also, labor became an important constituent that was mobilizing against Mugabe at that time. So after the 2000 elections, what is striking is that Mugabe, then decided that he was going to basically buck international pressure and international, opinion on the issue of land. And in response to the referendum not passing, the veterans basically organized occupations of a number of white farms. And in past years, the Mugabe administration would go and remove them and kick them off and tell them no, they couldn't squat on lands that did not belong to them. After the 2000 referendum, Mugabe allowed them to stay on the land, and that kind of sparked his demise, in particular with the international community, right? So then all of a sudden we were thinking, he's not our friend anymore, he's going to do some different things. Well, he actually did. He implemented what was called the fast-track land reform program, where he basically appropriated something like 80% of the white farmers' land in Zimbabwe and redistributed it to black Zimbabweans. That has been controversial. I want to kind of just give you a sense that Zimbabwe, Mugabe in particular, is both loved and hated. There's some aspects of the land reform program that many people supported and many people see certain benefits from. The land reform, the fast-track land reform program was the greatest transfer of property in Southern Africa since colonization. So it happened in a short period of time, and it was actually in some ways, in many ways, in all respects, very effective at basically redistributing the land back to indigenous Zimbabweans. Okay? The problem, of course, becomes is that came at the cost of the rule of law, that came at the cost of a lot of political coercion and political repression, that came at the cost of a degree of cronyism, and also economic decline. Economic decline occurred in part because of the lack of, or the decline in agricultural output, but it also occurred as a result of the very heavy and very strict sanctions that the international community, of course, immediately imposed on Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe has been in a bit of a free-fall economic decline since then, and has also, to a lesser extent, I would say, been in a bit of a free fall political decline. So that's without taking up too much any more time, that's kind of the background context to now you have, November 13, you have a 93-year-old Robert Mugabe as president of Zimbabwe, who has been in power for 37 years, with this background of having a history as being the liberator of his country, but then also one who has certainly has authoritarian and dictatorial tendencies. So I want to turn it over to the panel, and I apologize if I've kind of oversimplified, of course, a complex history, and I haven't even brought in any number of issues in terms of divisions between how the kind of political divisions between the Shona and Ndebele had played out. There's a lot for us to kind of understand and unpack here, and our panel is much more adept and better suited to do that than I am. So I wanted to turn over and give each of you an opportunity to first just comment on what happened in November, really this fall period. So the October and September, October, August, the beginning of this year. What happened in your estimation, and what's precipitated basically Mugabe's the military taking over Harare and Mugabe's resignation? I'll start with you, Mr. Moyo. I think you all can remain seated if you would like, or you can use the podium.
I think I'll just remain seated. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I think before I dive into the recent events, I'd like to maybe fill in a few gaps on the historical perspective.
Yes.
When Mugabe came into power in 1980, of course, he was viewed as a liberator because we had just come out of a protracted war of liberation. But immediately, when he got into power, he immediately showed his authoritarian dictatorial tendencies and immediately waged war against the opposition, which was led by Dr. Joshua Nkomo, mostly from the Ndebele tribe, where a genocide was committed and over 30,000 people were massacred. So this was the early years of Mugabe's rule. I'm talking early 80s. So immediately, right off the bat, he showed his true colors, and he wanted a one-party state. So he didn't want any opposition. But I think with pressure from outside, he was forced to create a semblance of of a democracy where he would carry these elections every 5 years, where he's already predetermined as the winner, and that facade continued. We would see offshoots of his ZANU-PF party creating little parties that would then challenge him, and obviously he would emerge the winner. And this continued until 1999, when the Movement for Democratic Change was formed by Morgan Tsvangirai, who was the Secretary General of the Labour movement, the Zimbabwe Trade Union. This was the first real opposition, I think, to the Mugabe rule, because the country had been run down so much with all the killings that had happened, and now the economic decline was just too severe for the Zimbabwe population. So the people decided that the only way was to create a political party out of this labor movement, and so was born the MDC. That's the party that I represent here in the US. Elections were conducted in 2000, which were not free and fair, because the results came out. It looked like Tsvangirai had won. Even up to today, those results are being contested in court. We've had these elections since then, which are questionable because they are not free and fair. There is intimidation. People are beaten up. There's been several killings during these elections, and Mugabe has barred international observers to come and monitor these elections. So obviously, he clearly has something to hide, or he had. And so he continued pronouncing himself the winner of these elections. In 2008, there was a different approach because the economy had pretty much crumbled. Inflation was at over 500 billion. They just continued printing money to try and deal with the problem. We ended up with 100 trillion dollar note that could only buy a can of soda. So they basically just continued printing money, thinking that they'll just buy the problems. But that wasn't supposed to be. The economy couldn't handle it. So in 2008 was the only time where we did have some form of credible election, of which Mugabe lost those elections to Morgan Tsvangirai. Mugabe was willing to concede, and then the army came in through Emerson Mnangagwa, who I will talk about just shortly, and they intervened and they stopped the announcing of the results for the elections. They took the ballot boxes away. They kept them for a month, and then they came back and said, "Oh yeah, Morgan Tsvangirai did win, but he needed 50% plus 1 to become the president. He only got 47%. Mugabe got like 43%. So we're gonna have a rerun for the presidential election." And during that period, for the rerun, Mugabe unleashed violence on the streets. Thousands of our members were killed. So our leader decided, you know what, I'm not gonna walk to State House over dead bodies. So he pulled out, and Mugabe ran by himself, and without our people voting, and he declared himself winner. And so he continued running down the country. At that time, they decided, well, the international community was not going to agree that he won the election. So they brought them together with the opposition and said, let's form a GNU, a government of national unity. And they made Morgan Tsvangirai the prime minister, and Mugabe remained the president. So we saw some improvement in the economy. The country started picking up again. for the 5 years that the GNU was in place, which was 2009 to 2013. So come 2013, we had other elections, and this time, this is where now we saw the full force of the rigging machinery that Mugabe had put in place. He came out again victorious, and that was the end of the GNU. And once again, the country started again declining, because clearly the problem with Zimbabwe is the problem of legitimacy. In the government legitimacy is in question. We have a government that is not recognized by the international community. Mugabe was not recognized in 2008 when he said he won. There are travel bans. There are travel bans for him and his cabal. They cannot visit the US, Europe, and other progressive communities, because they are not recognized as genuine leaders voted by the people in Zimbabwe. So because of that, those have been shut for foreign aid or foreign investments to come into the country. And so once again, we're seeing the country going back to the levels it was at in 2008. And as we were approaching this election, ZANU-PF, his party, had again nominated Mugabe at 93 years old to be the candidate for the elections that are coming next year. And that would have allowed him to rule another 5 years, which would have taken him to 42 years as the only ruler Zimbabwe has ever known. But then he made mistakes because he had an ambitious wife who had seen that actually they could turn this into a family dynasty, because, I mean, who else? I mean, Mugabe's managed to stay in power 37 years. All he does is just rigs the election, so she might as well just take over from him and just continue with the looting they've done. Krista talked about the land issue. The land was supposed to be distributed to the people, but it was not. Mugabe distributed it to himself and those around him, and used it to buy power from the judges. So the judiciary is compromised. All the judges have farms that Mugabe gave them. So obviously, if you have a case against the government, you are bound not to win because they are already in his pocket. All the guys around him, they were given farms. He himself took about 22 farms that he owns. So all those around him, and I'm talking just a few people, maybe not even more than 100, they took that land and kept it for themselves. And some of it is lying derelict because they don't know how to farm, so they basically just took the farm equipment, sold it, and the land is now barren. So we saw that a lot, which killed our economy as agricultural based. So because of that land being taken away from people who were producing, it was no longer productive, and so now we turn from bringing a bread basket where we used to even export food to being now a basket case, because now we're dependent on getting food aid now from even neighbors that we used to provide food to. So all these failures within the Mugabe regime have been piling up for 37 years. But the army has always propped him up because he's always made sure that through cronyism, nepotism, that they're all well fed, they all have farms. His budget was, I guess, skewed to probably maybe 60% would go to defense. Things like health, education, they went down the drain. They were not being accounted for in the budget. So things just went bad. As we talk now, the unemployment rate is 90%. And yet we're churning out graduates every year from our 6 universities. I think we churn out about 500 graduates every year. But they are not jobs, because the industry is pretty much died. We tried to bring it up during the GNU 2009 and 2013, but it's gone back to where it was and even worse. So fast track to what happened recently. I mentioned Mugabe's wife, Grace Mugabe, who wanted to now take over. She had managed to push one of the vice presidents out of the presidium, Joyce Mujuru, and now she had now targeted the second vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. And so she succeeded in getting him fired by her husband, but then that triggered the army to come in, because the army was loyal to Mnangagwa, because apparently he's been one of the guys that were in the liberation struggle. He's a war veteran from way back, so they kind of resonated with him. And because Mugabe fired him, he had to run for his life and jump the border into South Africa. At that time, the general Chiwenga was in China, and there were talks that on his arrival, Mugabe had sent the police to arrest him also at the airport. But then he got tipped off by the military intelligence, and they were there, heavy-handed, whisked him out, and then the coup happened. I know people are going to say it's not a coup, but then what do you call it? The military comes in, takes out the sitting president. What do you call that? In my definition in the dictionary and everywhere I've read, that is a coup. Well, Zanu can tell us that it's not a coup, but I mean, well, I think it's anyone can figure that out for themselves. If it wasn't a coup, Demka would still be in power, and it would still be their candidate for the 2018 elections. The fact that the army came in, took him out, and they replaced him with Emmerson Mnangagwa. And I must state here that to me, Emmerson Mnangagwa, as he stands, is a lame duck president, because he serves at the pleasure of the military. If the military puts you in there, they can take you out. So you just have to abide by what they tell you, what they want. So we can even see with the cabinet that he appointed, he's militarized the cabinet, because he's taken generals like the Air Force general and the other general from the army, threw them in there. People who don't have any experience at all running government, people who are just military people, trained soldiers. Right now, Zimbabwe is a military state. We have soldiers on the ground. The police, because the commissioner of police was seen to be siding with Grace Mugabe. He's been sidelined, and so are his police. The army now is policing the streets. We have boots on the ground on a daily basis, and they are starting now to abuse people. They are starting now to beat people, because, I mean, soldiers are not trained to enforce law. They are trained to fight wars. And so if you take them out there and bring them into the communities without the proper training, they are bound to start using what they know best, which is their military training, to deal with any situation. Zimbabwe cannot afford to be a military state. Neither can SADC or the AU afford Zimbabwe being a military state. There is a need for intervention by the international community to make sure that democracy is restored in Zimbabwe. Yes, we can argue that Mnangagwa is trying his best, but the bottom line is that he is limited as to what he can do, because the army is the one that is in control. We want free and fair elections come 2018. Those free and fair elections can only come by if the international community is allowed to come in and observe those elections and make sure that they are free and fair. They can only come about if the playing field is leveled for everybody to participate. The media right now is state controlled. We need the airwaves open for everyone to be able to campaign freely. We need all parties to be allowed to, which is going to be very difficult when you have soldiers on the ground. The people are scared already because of the intimidation. They were happy, of course, when the soldiers dethroned Mugabe, as we witnessed on the 18th of November when they came out in their thousands onto the streets celebrating the downfall of Mugabe. But that was celebrating the downfall of Mugabe, not exchanging ZANU with another ZANU. ZANU-PF is Mugabe's party. Not exchanging ZANU-PF with another ZANU-PF. People had hope that at last we'd come to a point where now democracy was going to be allowed to prevail in Zimbabwe. We feel that that's an opportunity that has been lost, because the cabinet that Mnangagwa has put in place shows that there is no real change that is going to come to Zimbabwe. We're going to have elections next year. It's going to be the same. We have over 4 million people, Zimbabweans, living in the diaspora. I'm one of those. And we don't have the right to vote, unlike other countries in our region, in the southern region, South Africa, Botswana, Mozambique. They all allow their citizens in the diaspora the right to vote. We have been denied that right to vote for obvious reasons. That 90%, 99 maybe Frenk is the only one. 99% of the people in the diaspora are anti-ZANU-PF and anti-Mugabe because of the atrocities that he committed, and the atrocities that I think we're going to see now that the country is under military rule. We've been fighting for a diaspora vote. Hopefully, if the army is serious about the change, which I doubt very much, because the signs are starting to show that they are in it for themselves. The reason the army actually intervened was because one of their own was fired by Mugabe. So they didn't do this because they wanted to see change. They did this to protect themselves, protect their interests, and we're going to see the same continue if we do not have real, genuine reforms that are going to guarantee free and fair elections in 2018.
Good. That's a good place to stop. For now, I'm going to get back to you in terms of the prospects for the future. Let me ask Dr. Guni to give his perspective on recent developments and anything that you want to add in terms of the historical context that got us to where we are today.
Thank you. I'm going to try and set some records straight here, because most of the issues raised by my colleague here are mere perceptions. They are not based on reality. And I'm going to set the record straight and give you evidence and references. I'm not going to deal with the genocide of the early 80s and so forth. Admittedly, yes. The government of Zimbabwe in the early 80s under then Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, who, by the way, was the defense minister. He doubled as the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense when Zimbabwe got independent, reacted very violently to an internal insurrection, and he created a special military division to deal with an armed insurrection. It's not like the government just woke up one day and decided to go and kill people. There was a reason why the government intervened, but there is no question within ZANU-PF or in the international community that the response was excessive compared to the threat that was in existence at the time. This is an issue that is controversial in Zimbabwe, and I don't think we can address it here adequately. Yes, we have had some commissions run by the Catholic Church, for example, which labeled the disturbances as genocide. But the international community hasn't labeled it as genocide yet.
The UN has.
No, the UN cites the report that was done by the Catholic Commission for Justice in Zimbabwe. But again, like I say, this is an issue that is probably not appropriate for this forum. I just wanted to make sure that people understand the context under which the military intervened in the early 80s, why the government had to send people to go and fight. The reason why the government sent the military was because there was an armed insurrection from the opposition. That's the reason. So let me fast forward to 2002, when the United States imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe together with the European Union. The reason, and it's still the reason today, and you can go and read it, the United States Congress has sanctions which are called ZIDERA, the Zimbabwe Democracy Act. The reasons for those sanctions was that there was belief that the government of Zimbabwe under President Robert Mugabe was stifling human rights. And consistently since that time, the US has renewed those sanctions because they had not seen enough improvement. There are economic sanctions, and then there were political sanctions. Political sanctions dealt with the travel bans and the freezing of accounts of government officials. Those have since been lifted by the European Union. All 28 members of the European Union, they have removed those sanctions. They are no longer necessary because they've seen some changes and improvements. The US hasn't removed the economic sanctions. The political sanctions are no longer effective, but the economic sanctions are still there. To give you a context, these sanctions were imposed by the United States Congress, and it takes Congress to remove them. Even if the current president or the past two presidents wanted to remove them, they just couldn't. It had to go through Congress, and Congress has its own processes. But yes, those sanctions are there, and we are sure that as we move into the new era, hopefully those sanctions will be removed. And I can assure you that we already have a congressman who has traveled to Harare to try and start that negotiation of ensuring that we have free, fair elections in the coming year. And in response, the United States is going to lift those sanctions through a congressional process. Fast forward to 2008, we had the elections. And let me correct something that my colleague here said. He said international observers are barred from observing elections in Zimbabwe. That's not true. Every election in Zimbabwe has always been observed by a regional body which comprises of 14 countries in Southern Africa. It's called SADC. Every election in Zimbabwe has always been observed by all 55 countries of the African Union. All of them. The only observers that were prevented from observing Zimbabwe's elections were from the European Union and the United States, because the government of President Robert Mugabe believed they were biased since they had already imposed sanctions on his government. And he was saying, look, you have imposed sanctions on us, why do you want to come and see how we run our elections? And in any case, there is no perfect election anywhere in the world, including here. So let's stick to facts and not just make suppositions. In 2008, the law had changed. The electoral law in Zimbabwe required that for somebody to win the elections and become president, they must win with at least 50 plus 1% of the total votes cast for the presidency. In 2008, the opposition party, the main opposition party, there are several of them. You might think there's only one opposition party, there are several of them. For example, right now, there are 53 legally registered political parties in Zimbabwe that are going to contest elections next year. But in 2008, the main opposition party that my colleague here represents, they indeed won 47%, and we won 43%. And according to the law in Zimbabwe, that requires a rerun to ensure that there's an outright winner who wins by at least a margin of 50%. At that time, there was no 50%. So there was a rerun done constitutionally. Unfortunately, and I have to admit this even though I'm from the ruling party, unfortunately, during the rerun electoral campaign period, there was violence. And indeed, our military and some of our party supporters were engaged in violence. The violence was largely perpetrated by people who supported the ruling party. That's not to say the opposition was not also involved in violence, but it got so way out of hand to the extent that the opposition party leader thought he could withdraw from the elections. But again, let me correct the record here. At law in Zimbabwe, he did not withdraw. because the law required that he had to give notice of 21 days prior to the election in order to legally withdraw his name. But he didn't. By the time he said he was withdrawing, it was already too late. That's why his name was on the ballot. And he lost the election. Possibly because he didn't have enough time, he didn't campaign towards the elections. He actually had to leave the country, and he went then into exile in Botswana. But the bottom line is ZANU-PF won those elections at law. And because the opposition leader had left the country and the economy was indeed on its knees, the regional leaders, remember I told you about SADC, the 14 countries in Southern Africa that form this body, which is like a peer review of countries, then saw that things were not well in Zimbabwe. They kind of intervened, and we had a government of national unity, which I must admit worked very well. And we saw the economy picking up again. So I just wanted to put the record straight there so that you don't come out of here with the wrong statements and wrong perceptions of what really transpired in Zimbabwe. Let me take you to what happened towards the November alleged coup, which was no coup. For the past 3 or so years, from 2014, actually 2013, we have had problems in the ruling party. The fundamental problem that happened, which led to the change in the presidents in Zimbabwe, was an internal ZANU-PF process. There was an internal power struggle. Everybody knows that our president, then president, former President Mugabe, was old. He's 93 years old. And nobody lives in perpetuity. There was need for us as a party to prepare as to what would happen after his presidency. And there was a power struggle. His wife wanted to take over, although internally within the provisions of our own party, she did not qualify to be president. ZANU-PF operates on a system of hierarchy. That is, it depends on your seniority, how long you have been in the party, and how have you been adhering to the party principles and so forth and so on. So the problem has always been internally. Now the problem in our party overlapped to the national government, because President Mugabe, being president of the party, happened to be president of the country as well. So what affected our party ended up affecting the whole nation, the whole country. And we saw that in the past year or 8 months, the First Lady had overtaken state powers. She really ran the government. She was firing ministers and ordering a change of government ministers, running government programs, including distribution of agricultural inputs. Like, for example, the government of Zimbabwe got a loan from Brazil to distribute tractors so that agriculture could be revamped. And she took charge of that, which was a government program. She was not a government employee. She had no constitutional authority or power to do anything concerning the government, but she took those powers. And she also took the powers of the president within the party. This is the context under which the military ended up intervening, because the firing of the Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa, who was then Vice President Emerson Mnangagwa then, was done unconstitutionally within our political party. At government level, the president had every right to fire his vice presidents. He, of course, is required to give some legal reasoning for that. But we all know that it was the First Lady who fired President Mnangagwa because she saw him as a threat. And when that happened, again, it was an overreach on her party, arrogating unto herself powers of the state which she didn't have. That's why the military intervened, because they realized that this was going to cause national pandemonium and we were going to see violence. It's true also that she engineered and attempted to have the commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces, General Chiwenga, arrested when he came back from duty in China. And thank God, some of our colleagues who participated in her plans to try and get the former Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa assassinated, not just fired, but fired and assassinated, and then arrested the head of the military. When that happened, everybody within the ruling party and the military realized, no, this has gone too far. We have to stop this. So, under Section 200 of the Zimbabwean Constitution, the military in Zimbabwe are empowered to stop potential threats to civil peace in Zimbabwe. That's why they intervened. They used a legal provision which is in the Constitution of Zimbabwe. That's why it was not a coup. Also, when they intervened, they did not suspend the Constitution. Standard coups, when the military take over, they suspend the Constitution, they arrest those in political power. That didn't happen. Yes, President Mugabe was put under house confinement for a period of time, but he never lost his constitutional powers. He himself said it in public. He mentioned it himself. So there was no coup. It was a smooth constitutional transfer of power because the president had failed to uphold his obligation to administer to run the country as empowered by the Constitution. His wife was now running the country, and that was clearly unconstitutional. And as you saw, for those who have been following these events, the president only resigned when Parliament, the Parliament of Zimbabwe, which is the equivalent of Congress here, decided to impeach him for dereliction of duty because he had handed over state powers to his wife, which is an unconstitutional a process which he had undertaken. And when he realized that he was definitely going to be impeached and dismissed by the Parliament of Zimbabwe, again, that was a legal process. That's when he realized he had no other choice but to resign. President Mugabe was not arrested. I was not arrested. He's not under arrest right now. He is free at home and sipping tea. And I repeat again, there was no coup. Let me also explain why the military is helping. Again, under the laws of Zimbabwe, the president is empowered by the Constitution and the Defense Act to call on the military when there are problems that the standard police are failing to deal with. One of the major problems that we had in Zimbabwe is police corruption. The police were engaged in corruption, and as I already alluded to, and as my colleague correctly pointed out, the police were involved in an attempt to get rid of the head of the army and the vice president. And when the military constitutionally exercised the powers that are enshrined in the Constitution for them, the police kind of disappeared from the streets. And for the first time, we had zero crime in Zimbabwe and on the streets. And now we're trying to get back the police to do their normal duties, and they are back on the streets. That's another point that I wanted to correct. The Zimbabwe Republic Police is back on the street. They're doing their jobs, but they're being assisted by the military because this is a transitional process. And we want to ensure that the police are retrained to avoid going back to the same corrupt tendencies that they were engaged in. We want a new, fair and clean police force and governance. Let me quickly move forward as to what to expect with the new government.
Oh, let me ask Calvin if he wants to just comment
Sure.
on up until now and recent developments, and then we'll go into the future.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be very brief, Dr. Johnson. Thank you for having me. I think the issue of the genocide of the 80s, to me, it's really a fundamental issue for Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, like many African countries, is an amalgamation of groupings that have been forced to live together in spite of whatever disagreements they may have had in the past. And I think listening to my colleagues and the disagreement, to me, it's one of the concerns that we have for the future. The inability of one side, I think, to appreciate what has taken place. And if you cannot appreciate, then I think your ability to come to solutions becomes compromised. My own family members were victims of this genocide. So to say they were armed insurrections when I knew them not to be in any armed insurrection, it's very challenging for us. We have colleagues from South Africa here. They understand, I think, those issues. When you don't resolve these past conflicts, they always shackle the country from going. Right here in this country, in the US, the issues of post-slavery, of compensation or addressing the wrongs for people of color, you never address, and you see 400 years later we are still dealing with the issues. And I think that is the case for Zimbabwe. They have to deal with these issues head on. And it's unfortunate some of those who are implicated are the ones who are now at the apex of running the country. The issue of SADC proclaiming legitimacy on the elections. SADC itself is a body that has very limited legitimacy. When you look at some of the people who are in there, they are themselves almost running for 37 years in power. Some Dos Santos of Angola, who just left office, people like King Mswati, they are hardly people you would be your first point of call to come and determine on an election. We have countries like DRC in SADC who haven't had elections. And my colleagues know that. So how can these be the ones who come and observe your own elections? I think we do ourselves a disservice as Zimbabweans when we don't go for best practice. We go for the lowest common denominator. Botswana was one of the countries that came out and said this is not a free, and they refused to participate in future observations because they said it's a sham what has taken place. So I think if we are taking balanced views of what those who observed said, some said yes, it's good. Some said no, this is a sham. In terms of the definition of the coup, I think we had a High Court decision in Zimbabwe recently, yes. Justice Chiweshe, who said no, this was a very constitutional process. Our government in Zimbabwe has a history of fantastic interpretations of the law. And the land decisions are one of the recent examples. They went, no, this is not expropriation, and they went to the SADC tribunal. Today we don't have a SADC tribunal because of the government's interpretation. They couldn't accept the tribunal's correction of their wrong interpretations. If you go back in our history from the 80s, 90s, we have a history of these fantastic interpretations of the law of the Constitution, which the courts sometimes have challenged, lawyers have challenged, or the government has quickly reversed itself. Okay, so I'll leave that interpretation there. What happened, I think we are all agreed it was a factional dispute within ZANU-PF, which the military then has stepped in. To me then, if it was a factional dispute, it brings into question why the military seeks to clothe its actions as a constitutional issue, as if there was imminent danger to the nation. Nobody was. It was business as usual before the coup, business as usual after the coup on the streets. So it was a factional dispute within the ruling party. And if you go back in the history of the ruling party, I think Frenk can elaborate further. The military, from the time of our struggle, has always been the power broker in the ruling party and subsequently in the government. And I think what has happened now is they have come out in the open. Their legacy was in danger. Even now, the Operation Restore Legacy, ironically, I think they've now come out in the open as power brokers. In the past, they were in the shadows. As they said, now the cabinet, they are military people there, to show that they are the ones who call the shots. So I don't know to the extent that the new president is a lame duck. We shall see. But he's in a difficult, he has to balance a very tight rope, in my opinion. And I'm concerned when I see military in the cabinet. We have had military people in the past running parastatals, the airline of Zimbabwe, the railways of Zimbabwe, the oil company of Zimbabwe, were all run by military before. Today they are all, for all intents and purposes, insolvent. So that is the military running public institutions. They are a disaster. So I don't know what the future bodes for them, their participation in government. The legacy of the coup, for us, as I have to agree with Denford here, it's concerning. Is this now mean each time next year we have elections, if the military is not satisfied with the result and they step in again, what do we say? And SADC and the AU have compromised themselves by accepting this, because if the military step in again next year, they will say we are doing it again to restore civil order, and in terms of constitution, it shouldn't be. The AU itself, 2006, had a very explicit declaration. They don't accept military intervention in the handover of power. So I think we are in a challenging position come 2018 in terms of the legacy of the military. We really have to push back as a nation on the military, that they cannot interfere in civilian affairs like this. The other issue of interest to me, I don't want to go over the same issues the colleagues have touched on, was the geopolitical interest of the events in Zimbabwe, the role of China, and you are seeing an interesting rush of countries like China, the UK, to endorse the new president and events in Zimbabwe. I don't know if it's Brexit and the British are looking for friends or what it is, but there it is. But I think the international community must not be too quick to try to sanitize this new government. They really have to hold their feet to the fire, just like we Zimbabweans in our activism have to do the same. It's important. They have to be reforms going forward, and I think issues of accountability and so on we can discuss when we talk about. So my last two issues I'll mention. The cabinet came out recently, and we were very disappointed. Some of us.
Why?
We were hoping to see a cabinet more. We have people who have been in cabinet for 37 years. 37 years is my whole life, and you cannot, for many of them, and I would challenge Dr. Guni, point to 3-4 achievements that many of them have done, but we recycle them as if we are not a country with competent young people, bright people who have known achievements that we can put. I don't mind if you say experience, yes, but have a balanced cabinet and mix experience with youth, with people who bring something fresh. So I think even the investors themselves, when I read Bloomberg and so on, there was a lot of looks like it's more of the same. We shall see. This was the sentiment. And for a government whose problem to me has not really been legitimacy but confidence, to now put the same people who brought the lack of confidence, I think it was a shot in the foot by the government in some ways. But we shall see. So this to me are my concerns going forward, the issues of tribalism and so on, that we continue again to anticipate to see if we cannot resolve those issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any? We don't have any connection.
No. Can I quickly address this issue of the cabinet thing?
Yes.
Because I think it's important to clarify here. The question of the cabinet in Zimbabwe, let me again give background and reasons why the cabinet is constituted the way it is. My colleagues fail to recognize that Zimbabwe, like any other country, operates through the provisions of the law and the constitution. The constitution of Zimbabwe allows the president to only appoint cabinet ministers from parliament. Okay? There are only 5 people that he can appoint outside of parliament. Every minister must be a sitting member of parliament. So when my colleagues say he should go and find young people and appoint them as ministers, he will be doing that outside the provisions of the law. The constitution says every cabinet minister must be a member of parliament. And the people in parliament are the people he appointed. We even reached out to the opposition. We talked to the opposition to be in our cabinet. 3 of them had agreed. to be in the cabinet, but if, at the last minute, the Movement for Democratic Change declined for their own selfish reasons. To be honest, it was their leadership, not the members of parliament who had agreed to be ministers. They were even shocked that their own leadership declined to have them participate in the new cabinet. Moreover, let me clarify something very important here. This new cabinet is only a cabinet for a period of 6 to 7 months, because we're having the elections next year. And again, under the Constitution of Zimbabwe, elections in Zimbabwe next year can only be held between July 18th and August 28th. So the cabinet that has been appointed is a transitional cabinet, because it's going to do very little given the limited time. But I wanted to address this fundamental issue of people saying, oh, he should have appointed more women, he should have appointed young people. Sure, he has those desires, but he can't create a new parliament. He has to pick from the pool that is there. In the military terms, they say, you go to war with the army you have, not the one you wish for.
A rebuttal on that, Frank. The Zimbabwe Parliament has 210 members of Parliament. ZANU itself, being in the majority, has a lot of young talent in there that he could have pulled from. What the complaint is about here is recycling the same old failed people. We have people like Chinamasa, who failed as a finance minister, and once again he's back at the house. We have people like Opet Mpofu, who as Minister of Mines amassed so much wealth for himself that now he owns half of Matabeleland. He's still in that same cabinet. And then took off the 5 people that the president had an opportunity to appoint. And who does he pull those from? From the military. And then you come. What do you mean what's wrong with that? Where is the balance there? We're talking here of a cabinet. Couldn't he go to business? Couldn't he go to academia to pull people that can come in? Which people?
We have Chitando from the mines. We have professors from the University of Zimbabwe. We have 5 new people that you don't even know their names.
But then you have 3 military guys.
Yeah.
The 5.
What's wrong with that?
We're just saying here that.
I mean, what's wrong with that?
So what is a military guy going to do as a foreign affairs minister? What does he know about?
He has a PhD in international relations.
But he's a soldier. He's not trained in.
He has a PhD in international relations.
Well, PhDs in Zimbabwe, we take them with a pinch of salt. Because even Grace Mugabe has a PhD. That's after 3 months. So these PhDs here that come from Zimbabwe, you have to take them with a pinch.
I mean, let's be serious. There are some things that you just say statements for the sake of saying it because you are the opposition. But let's stick to the facts. I'm trying to be objective. When there are shortcomings for our government, for our party, I acknowledge those. And I think we should be generous.
No, what we are saying, even the international community and every other observer is saying is that this cabinet is more of the same. Right. There is really no change in this cabinet. You need to accept that. You cannot continue defending the indefensible because it suits you.
Right. You have to accept that.
Why would everybody just accept ZANU? Think that there's something wrong with this cabinet?
It's a cabinet by a ZANU-PF government. What's your problem? We are going to have elections in 6 months. If you don't like what ZANU-PF is doing, elect yourselves.
Right. What's the problem? Are we going to have free and fair elections?
Absolutely.
What are the guarantees for that?
We're
going to go to that.
Quickly respond,
I think one other interesting, for me, observation is that this coup, it served to rejuvenate what was essentially, to some of us, a dying party. I think those led by the First Lady, they were almost successful in destroying the party.
Yes.
And just as they were about to deal a knockout blow, the military intervened. So it has rejuvenated the ruling party. It's an ominous sign for the opposition, because if this new government can secure some quick wins, they are making a lot of the right noises. Whether they will deliver or not, we don't know. But if they secure those quick wins, especially on the economy, I think it presents a lot of challenges for the opposition, whose mantra for the last 20 years has been Mugabe must go. Mugabe is gone now. Now they have to reinvent. The opposition themselves don't inspire a lot of confidence. They have succession issues themselves.
Yes.
A leader who has been there almost 20 years, he has his own personal shortcomings, he has his own factions within his party. The opposition has run, and we have discussed this with Denford briefly, they have run various municipalities and is not inspiring the performance and the track record. I know they like to point to the GNU, but to me the GNU was more stabilizing rather than a growth economy. It was coming from a very low base. You couldn't do any worse, basically, than what was there. So the two options presenting Zimbabweans are very worrying, if I can put it that way.
Agreed.
Well, can I answer?
You can,
Other
okay, I'll
questions
give you,
or
I'll give you a minute to do that. Please go on. I'm just signaling to my colleague. No.
No.
Well,
We need winner.
Okay, sorry, go on.
as much as the ZANU-PF has been rejuvenated by this so-called renewal within the party, you must understand that Mugabe commanded a very dominating position in ZANU-PF, and there's so much joy that he is gone, not just within ZANU-PF but within the entire country. There shouldn't be mistakes from ZANU-PF to think that the joy that the people of Zimbabwe are showing is that they are now in favor of ZANU-PF. Morgan Tsvangirai has been the best foot forward for Zimbabwe from the onset. If you talk of the population of Zimbabwe, he is their favorite because of the democratic tendencies of the party. I mean, MDC is a party for the poor people, is a party for the workers, and has really made great inroads on the population. That's why we have won all the votes in the cities in all the past 4 or 5 elections. ZANU-PF always comes back and says it's won in rural areas where there's even questionable issues regard the population there, because there's always the voter registration, the voters' roll has not been clear. It's been full of ghost voters. There's never been really free and fair elections. If you put Morgan Tsvangirai today with anyone from ZANU-PF, at this moment in time, Morgan Tsvangirai is going to emerge the winner. That's a fact. He might have his shortcomings, and we might have those shortcomings as a party, but the fact that ZANU-PF is a diseased entity that Zimbabwean people in general just do not want to associate with, for obvious reasons. For a very long time, ZANU-PF has ruled with an iron fist. People have been murdered, and so I understand my brother Kelvin there, his concerns about the opposition. But if we leave that decision to the people, at any given point in time, between today and tomorrow, you put any ZANU-PF candidate in a free and fair election, they will never win against Morgan Tsvangirai.
That's a fallacy, my brother.
We'll see very soon.
Absolutely.
So elections are scheduled, or must be held before September of 2018.
Yes.
Right.
And beginning next week, I believe it is, ZANU-PF is going to have its own Congress.
Yes.
Could you say a little something about what that process is going to entail, and what that is going to how the outcome of that process might bode for what we can anticipate seeing in 2018?
Sure. Let me quickly run through that. So, a little bit piggybacking, when President Mnangagwa came back and President Mugabe resigned, the party, ZANU-PF, nominated current President Mnangagwa to be president of the party and also president of the country. But under our own constitution within the party, he has to be confirmed at Congress, which is what's happening next week from December 12th to the 15th. The party will endorse him as the substantive president of the party and the country, and our candidate for 2018 for president. That's also going to kickstart our campaign manifesto and our campaign strategy for 2018. We are going to start preparing a robust movement to campaign for a total win. And this time I can assure you, we are doing necessary reforms both at party level and at government level. Today, there was a budgetary presentation in Parliament today, but there was also a significantly important activity that happened today. The new Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs today introduced to Parliament electoral reforms that are going to realign the Electoral Act of Zimbabwe with the Constitution of Zimbabwe, which means that elections next year are going to be held under the new constitutional provisions, which means the electoral body is going to be fully funded, fully independent, and run the elections according to the provisions of the law. The biggest problem we have had in the past was that the electoral law said something else, whereas the constitution was at variance with those provisions. So you could possibly get away with doing things that were inconsistent with the constitution. Sorry about that. You could do things that were inconsistent with the constitution and still get away with it. But because of these new provisions, you can't do that anymore. And I've personally spoken to President Mnangagwa. He is more determined than anybody else that next year's elections must be free, fair, and transparent, and according to the laws of Zimbabwe. He's going to allow observers to come in. But again, let me say something that my brother Kevin said here. Observers, yes. Observers are not judges. They come to observe. All elections in any country are governed by the local laws. We can have elections, election observers from the moon or from Mars, but they are not going to come and determine who is the winner and who is not. Their job is to come in and observe whether the process has been transparent, fair, and free. But the final judgment is based on the prevailing laws. We have had disputed elections here in this country. And talking about the military, let me just finish that point. They're complaining about having the military in our cabinet. How many generals do we have in the cabinet right here that the current president is appointed? So they are allowed, and the law in Zimbabwe simply says.
How many have quit?
Well, that's a different. The law in Zimbabwe allows for military people to be appointed, but they must take off the uniform, which is something they've already done. They've removed their uniforms and they've been assigned appropriate roles based on their qualifications and individual capacities.
But do you take Calvin's point that it's regional, because he's right, I think, in a lot of ways, that the AU and SADC has a problem, right? I mean, they were up between a rock and a hard place. Absolutely. Was it a coup? Was it not a coup? And then they said it was not a coup. And one can see how they rationalize that in their mind. But that doesn't address the ongoing challenge and the ongoing problem of not having the military, or ensuring that the military does not play a prominent role in politics and certainly in regime change.
Yes, I agree with that. Actually, in the Constitution of Zimbabwe, there are limitations as to what the military can do, and they're actually prohibited from direct party activities, for example, under the new constitution. And those are the things that I'm mentioning that are being realigned to ensure that the existing law conforms to the constitution. I agree with him that there are concerns that what role would the military continue to play? What if after the elections in 2018 they say, well, we don't like what happened and we're going to intervene again?
Oh yeah, I mean, Chiwenga himself said that anyone without liberation war credentials will not be allowed to rule Zimbabwe. He has said it, and he has not pulled that statement. Even up to today, we have not heard him say, you know what, with this new dispensation, we're going to allow free and fair environment where anyone who's chosen by the people shall lead. Right. We still have that hanging over our heads.
True, but you have to also address the context under which the statements were said. He was not the first general to say that. The first person who said that was General Jinarashi. Right. And the reason why that statement was made was because international bodies and other countries were directly funding and pushing the opposition, trying to remove a constitutionally elected government. That was the reason why the military said, if we are going to have external powers coming in and removing a constitutionally elected government and replacing it with an opposition they favor, then we as the military, we are not going to allow that.
But you just did.
Yeah.
I know.
I think Dr. Johnson, one of the serious challenges Zimbabwe faces, and several other African countries that have these liberation movements, is this legacy that they cannot separate the party from the state or from the government. And
That's
the
true.
two continue to overlap, and officials are not clear when they're acting on behalf of the party or when they are acting as public servants because they are paid military generals. As you can see, that type of statements are partisan statements. A general is not a general of ZANU-PF. He is a general for the Zimbabwe army paid by the Zimbabwean taxpayer. But he's making statements in support of a certain party to threaten, in essence, he's threatening the opposition. So to us, this legacy, it continues to worry. And I feel what we have in Zimbabwe is an extortionary, and I'm sorry to say, it's an extortionary military, an extortionary set of war veterans. They show up periodically when they've run out of money, or I don't know what they do, to come and extort the state. They were doing this in the 80s. They were paid demobilization.
Yeah,
It's like they have failed to transform themselves to survive in the economy. So in the 80s they were paid demobilization. They all got $450, $185 for 2 years. They were back again a few years later. No, we want land. Fair enough, this was the demand. They have gotten land in the invasions. They came again, we want compensation. They looted 2 funds, they looted and finished that fund. They are back again demanding 100 seats guaranteed in the new parliament. So until we overcome this group, we always are being pulled in a way which I think our country, 77% of our population is under 35 years old. And this is the concern with the cabinet. When you have cabinet average age 65, it doesn't speak to young people and their aspirations. Even in the economic blueprint, when we talk about the future, I've always argued this constant throwing of state resources into land, into agriculture. Agriculture is just 15% of our economy. Young people, is that their aspiration? To be farmers, or is to go into IT to build the next Silicon Valley? Is this, we don't speak to those issues. We continue to harp on this 1971 economy, which no longer, in my mind, it no longer exists. But that's what happens when you put old, I don't mean to be ageist, but this is what happens when there's no balance with you.
Elect young people in 6 months and they'll be appointed cabinet ministers.
Yeah,
That's the solution.
I think we all agree here that a military state is not the best for Zimbabwe.
Sure.
So we have to come together and agree that the military belongs in the barracks.
Exactly.
And there has to be tangible efforts made by the government to to bring back confidence to the people that the military, they've done what they've done. Like you say that the constitution, it's amazing that all of a sudden ZANU-PF people are now at the forefront of constitutionalism when for the past 37 years they've been ravishing the very same constitution that now they want to hold sacrosanct. Clearly times have changed. But let's start with the military. Let's all agree that the military goes back to the barracks. That would be a starting point. I think that you need to, since you said you talk to Mangaba directly. I know he doesn't have that power, but he can convince them, influence them, that for the international community to recognize us as a government, and that will be able to hold free and fair elections. You guys need to go back to the barracks. The army is. I understand that the police are very corrupt.
So you want them
But I think it was because Zimbabwe itself was corrupt right from the top, from Mugabe himself. When you look at things like $15 billion going missing from the diamond mining, and Mugabe coming up and confessing that we lost 15 billion, and not even one person, not even an investigation, and then at the same time you have the Minister of Mines buying a bank for 23 million during the same period. He's the one who was responsible for the mining sector, and he is buying a bank, buying land, spending millions, and on the other hand, with 15 billion that's missing. and the new government still puts him back into the cabinet. I don't know what message we are really sending, not only to Zimbabweans, but even to the international community. How serious are we about moving forward? Are we really serious about this real change, that the euphoria that has grasped the people of Zimbabwe? They are dying so much inside for change. Are we supposed to go the Arab Spring, create a Zim Spring for us to actually experience that change? Because it is not forthcoming. At this rate that we are going, we're seeing more of the same. There is no hope for Zimbabwe.
There is hope for Zimbabwe. For starters, let me clarify the 15 billion question that's being thrown around. There was never anybody who verified that there was $15 billion that was lost. President Mugabe himself confessed that he said that figure because he wanted to make an exuberant statement about the corruption that was going on. There was never anyone who actually said, well, was it 3 billion, was it 2 billion that was lost? But everybody agrees that, yes, there was a lot of spillage. A lot of money that came from diamonds never made its way to the national fiscus. That's true. And I agree that those issues need to be investigated and the culprits must be brought to book. And we're seeing those things happening now. I can tell you last night, the government of Zimbabwe froze accounts of 7 people. 7 people. 6 of those people were ministers in the previous government. Their bank accounts have been frozen and they are under investigations. We have the former Minister of Finance who is in court. He is in custody. He has been in custody since the constitutional removal of Mugabe. There are about 200 investigations going on right now. And these are senior party and government officials being investigated for economic crimes. And this is what I mean when I say we are not just talking. We are bringing in tangible evidence that the current president is committed to change the party, to change the country for the better, for everyone. And again, I agree, the president has already said once the military are done with dealing with this corruption, then they are going back to the barracks. We have a very professional army. The problem is the police were the leading corrupt government entity. And you can't expect the same president to bring back the same people that they are complaining about without correcting the problem. That's why they are being assisted by the military. But once that issue is solved, they are going to go back to the barracks where they belong and wait to defend the country when the country is under threat from both internal and external forces. But you can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. It's either we get rid of corruption or we bring back the same people that we are complaining about.
We agree that we have to get rid of corruption. But what we are seeing right now is a purging of those that were in the other faction of ZANU-PF. We are not seeing...
If they are corrupt, what is wrong with that?
Mnangagwa himself is corrupt.
So you want him to arrest himself?
We're just saying that at least he can start by within his own faction.
That's the other problem, that you guys, you just throw away statements. You're saying Obetu Mpofu has been corrupt. Mm-hmm. Do you have evidence to that effect?
Of course.
Okay, present it to the police and you'll be arrested.
Presented.
By whom?
How much does the
just
minister
sitting here and saying minister so and so is corrupt is nothing official.
No, I mean
anybody can say anything. I can say you are corrupt.
His assets have been vetted from what he earns as a minister and the businesses he's gonna.
He has been in business all his life from the time he came from college in India. He has been a businessman. If he is corrupt, bring the evidence to the authorities and he will be arrested.
There are court cases pending that have been thrown out by the government because it doesn't want to investigate its own. What we are saying is Mnangagwa should just stop this paging. I'm not saying criminals should not be arrested, but he should also look inward to his own faction if he's really serious about cleaning up corruption.
I think really, I understand Dr. Guni must defend the position. What he must perhaps tell us is since independence, and Mugabe repeatedly said there's too much corruption, How many officials have gone to prison for corruption in Zimbabwe since independence? I think you can count on one or two hands.
Agreed.
You see, so it's not a party which goes after corruption. It will reward loyalism, and I think if for us here, we must think about what is the Zimbabwe we want, rather than just to dig in on the party position. This is what is the Zimbabwe we want, because a corrupt activity, it also robs you.
Absolutely.
And your children, and we see all our ministers flying to South Africa for treatment. It means their corruption has robbed our institutions. Nobody wins out of it. So to defend people who are corrupt, know that it doesn't help us as a nation, I think.
No, I'm not defending. All I'm saying is we should not just throw statements into people's
But
names.
you have admitted yourself that the Minister of Police was running a corrupt outfit.
Yes, that's why he's
So
under
how could
arrest.
he investigate anybody? Yet he himself was running a corrupt outfit.
That's why he's under arrest and he's going through the court process.
Right.
And if anybody else you know of has been corrupt, bring their names and they'll be arrested.
No,
That's what we're
I
saying.
think what we are seeing, Dr. Johnson, is, as Denford is saying, a selective application of justice. It may be nice to people to say, oh, so and so is, but in the bigger scheme of things, is not how we want to build the society.
Agreed.
The institutions must be neutral. They are going back to what they've been doing in the past, to using prosecution authority to settle scores. And this is not what we want in the news.
Are you denying that the people who have been arrested were not corrupt?
But are they the only ones? There is
I'm not saying
a
that.
UN report fingering the military. It's very clear. If you want a docket, go to that report.
What's that report?
Eh?
The one from DRC?
Yes.
Well, it was a report. There's
So why
nothing
don't
more.
you investigate that report?
Well,
If it tells you that these people are corrupt,
we are dealing with Zimbabwe, not DRC.
why don't we do a lifestyle audit of all these generals? Let's do that.
Actually, it's in the monetary statement today.
So
I want to see if we can bring in our colleague from South Africa. Can we see him?
Yeah, we'll try to do that now here.
And hopefully John can hear us.
John, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we're gonna, they will be able to see you, but you won't be able to see them. So hold on one second.
And I apologize for that. Oh. So let me just introduce who's coming up on the screen here. This is Professor John Trimble, who is a former professor at Howard. Have you officially retired now, John? I can call you.
I'm sorry?
Have you officially retired from Howard now?
Yes.
Okay, so a former colleague and professor here at Howard University has been based in and living in South Africa for the past 3 or 4 years, but has lived in Zimbabwe and has extensive experience in Zimbabwe as well. So we wanted to and I'm delighted that we're able to connect with you virtually like this. You've heard, unfortunately, this is kind of at the tail end of our presentation, so you've heard a little bit of the debate and discussion between the MDC rep and ZANU-PF rep. I wanted to give you an opportunity, perhaps just 10 minutes or so, to give your perspective being there in South Africa. What are you hearing on the ground? What are the kind of anticipated challenges moving forward now? I think we've given enough of a context in terms of the background to what has happened. Looking forward now, there's a lot of skepticism that I've heard on this panel, but actually in other venues here in the United States, that there's a lot of skepticism among Zimbabweans about the role of SADC and South Africa and other regional players moving forward with regards to Zimbabwe. Are you feeling that there, or is Zimbabwe going to play? South Africa and other regional partners going to play a bigger role? Could you speak to us for 10 minutes and give us your insights and reflections, please?
Well, here you hear some of the same media and different options from those that are firm supporters of President Mugabe, to those that appreciate change in ZANU-PF, to those that think there needs to be a broader change. But you have to look beyond I think a lot of that look at Zimbabwe is right. Any more than those merchants that may figure some way to get around things and steal $1,000, or politicians that may steal a couple $100,000. But the real damage is being done by the blockade that's led by the U.S. and Britain. I first went to Zimbabwe in 2002. I lived there from 2003 to 2004, and again in 2013 and 14. And when I was there the first time in 2003 and 4, I saw the damage that was being done by the blockade in terms of the extreme hyperinflation it was causing. I was at the university where we were allocated funds to start a new computer lab, to bring in 25 computers. By the time we got the money, we could buy 2 computers. This was a direct result of the hyperinflation that was caused by the limited access to funds and credit that Zimbabwe had. This is the real damage that was done that affected the masses of people and continues to be a problem. This is what forced Zimbabwe to get off the abandoned Zimbabwe money and get on the US dollar. But of course they can't print US dollars, so they're still at the mercy of being able to have access to credit. All countries operate on credit, just like businesses do. When you deny somebody credit, that's like denying you credit and saying you can't have credit, you can't buy a house, you can't buy a car, you can't buy anything. So this is what the real damage. And I think that people are getting caught up in, some people are saying, oh, the new government was brought in by China because the president had been trained in China. You have other people that are saying that it was a coup. You have other people that are saying it wasn't a coup. I don't think it was a coup, but I think we have to get beyond those differences that may exist between opposition party and between governing party, and realize the real culprit in this situation is the U.S. government, the British government, and those that align with them in terms of denying credit to Zimbabwe. That's the real problem.
Let me ask Den Moyo to respond to that, to the extent that you and you're in a difficult situation, but the extent to which we can what percentage of Zimbabwe's economic ills can we put on the international community, but specifically also moving forward, what conversations you're the MDC representative here in the United States, what kinds of conversations are you having with the U.S. government now? Are there prospects for the sanctions to be fully lifted before the elections? Is that a conversation, or is that a position that you're advocating for, or not?
Well, I think we have to first understand that we can't put the cart before the horse. There are fundamental issues in Zimbabwe, human rights issues, electoral issues, democracy that need to be addressed. And unless those issues are addressed first, then we're always going to have this problem of people not willing to assist Zimbabwe financially. Why is it so difficult to have free and fair elections that the whole world can see and agree that they're credible and will open doors for foreign direct investment and all other forms of investments? Our problem has always been that of legitimacy, of a government that is not recognized internationally because that government comes through cohesion and not an electoral process that is free and fair and credible. If we can start there, if all our focus from today will be on ensuring that the next plebiscite is free and fair, and will get the recognition from the international community, I would say all these problems that our esteemed colleague is talking about will be a thing of the past. Mm-hmm. We just have to address the things that are causing us in the first place to be on the other side when it comes to people wanting to invest in Zimbabwe, or even risk their funds. Zimbabwe right now owes the IMF and the World Bank over $10 billion. They failed to maintain the loans.
Yeah.
We cannot continue. Who in their right mind would continue lending money to somebody who doesn't pay back the money that they owe? And yet they live in nations. When you look at them, when you look at the ministers in the ZANU-PF government, when you look at Mugabe himself, and you look at his lifestyle, and you look at the lifestyle of these people here, you can see that clearly it's not lack of funds to pay back these loans. It's because of the corruption and the greed, and them looking out for just themselves and their small cabal. We want a Zimbabwe that is a Zimbabwe for all, a Zimbabwe that is open to business for all, where corruption is brought down, where the political environment is such that the elections are free and fair and a credible leader is chosen by the people. Then we won't have this problem. As long as we have ZANU-PF in power without those guarantees for free and fair elections, then we're going to have these problems in perpetuity.
Well, yeah, yes, let me just jump in there. Again, let me clarify some things. My brother has a tendency of just throwing statements. Zimbabwe is a legitimate country. It's a sovereign state with a recognized government by the United Nations, by every other country there, including the United States, by the way. We have an embassy there. The United States has an embassy there. We have diplomatic relations with Zimbabwe. So don't throw statements like nobody recognizes the government of Zimbabwe. That's not true. It's a total blue lie. So let's correct. Let's stick to facts. Okay, I agree that we need to democratize the electoral process in Zimbabwe. We need to improve the human rights situation in Zimbabwe. Those are fundamentals. But there is no country without human rights issues, including here. I mean, every country there are some problems, but that's not an excuse to say we shouldn't strive to do better in Zimbabwe. And we are promising the new government, the new party structure is promising to say, let's all engage together. Let's all work together, opposition, academia, and everybody. Let's all work together to ensure that we have free and fair elections. The starting point is the legal process, because everything has to be defined within the provisions of the law. And I've just alluded to the fact that today, the Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs introduced electoral reforms to ensure that we are in conformity with the Constitution of Zimbabwe, and the elections in Zimbabwe are going to be held under a free, fair, and democratic environment for everyone. And whoever wins,
including me.
Yes, and there's another issue that I need to clarify here about the diaspora vote. Yeah. Let me be very clear. The Constitution of Zimbabwe guarantees the diaspora vote. Every Zimbabwean has a right to vote. But because it was not, the electoral law was not aligned with the Constitution, the old electoral law did not require the government of Zimbabwe to ensure that Zimbabweans outside of Zimbabwe have access to voting. That's what is being implemented now. That's what the Minister of Justice has just introduced to ensure that happens. Whether or not we're going to have people in the diaspora being able to vote in 6 months, I doubt that's possible because of course, the procedural processes and also the cost of doing that. But every Zimbabwean has a right to vote. Right now, if you go back to Zimbabwe, you can go and register in any constituency that you want, and you can vote in 6 months. But that right is there. Let's not tell people things that are not factual. There is a guaranteed right for every Zimbabwean, wherever they are, to vote. And that's being operationalized as we speak.
I think to respond to the professor on the issue of the squeeze that the economy was feeling from lenders, our economic problems started almost immediately after independence, because we were spending a lot on the social sector, understandably, education, health, but we quickly ran into balance of payments issues. Our very first finance minister, Chizero, had to go for a structural adjustment program.
Yes.
And it has been that cycle for us ever since. As Denford is saying, and I think Dr. Guni is also agreeing, we don't have a strong record of financial management. Even with the little that we have, if you look, our Reserve Bank had a serious problem of quasi-fiscal activities. Again, we mentioned the war veterans and the ruling party. They like to use state funds as a feeding trough, and this is part of our problem. We have almost $1 billion unaccounted for that was now assumed as a public debt by the recent $500 million that they've done for Command Agriculture. You find those funds are not properly audited. People don't pay back.
Yeah, but those are private funds. They are not state funds.
But in the end, it becomes a state debt. You see. And that is why it concerns us when we see a military man is now Minister of Agriculture. It's clear now they've seen this is a vehicle for the future, that we do more of these funds. And people are getting input. It's like manna from heaven.
But you have to accept that's an assumption. You don't have facts that that's what's going to happen.
We have the $1 billion from the RBZ as part is prologue. You've done it before, and they didn't pay back.
Yeah, but it was not a private fund.
But they didn't pay back. They don't pay back loans. Mm-hmm. The Chinese said to our finance minister, "You keep coming for loans. We are your only friend left. Mm-hmm. You don't pay back loans."
Mm-hmm. Well, the Chinese,
our finance minister said it himself.
The Chinese
just embarrassed by the Chinese.
Just yesterday, the Chinese signed a new loan to Zimbabwe amounting to $260 million.
Part grant, mind you. It's part grant.
Yes.
Right.
It's part grant and part loan.
Right.
And they just gave us
a very small loan.
Absolutely.
$100 million is nothing.
Well, it's $260 million.
Right. So,
but I agree that it's just a small drop in the bigger bucket. Let me also one issue. My brother here says Zimbabwe owns the World Bank and IMF 10 billion. That's not true. 10 billion is the cumulative figure that includes everybody that we owe, including the domestic market. Actually, the large amount of that money is domestic debt and the debt that we owe to the African Development Bank and other financiers. And we have fully serviced our debt to the IMF. The World Bank, yes, we still have a big debt there, but we have serviced our debt to the IMF. So again, let's stick to the facts, not just statements that come out of our heads and we throw them to the public.
It's well documented that the IMF and World Bank combined are all 10 billion.
No, that's not true.
It's been in public domain for years.
No.
Even Chinamasa, when Chinamasa visited here not so long ago, and he visited the IMF,
I was with him.
When he went there to beg for loans, he was told the same thing, that you haven't serviced this $10 billion loan. That
true.
But why are you saying that it's not
$10 billion? The $10 billion is the total debt that Zimbabwe owes to everybody.
And Frank, what we are paying back is not the loan.
Yes, we are
paying back arrears.
Yes, we
haven't even started dealing with the loan.
And yes, we acknowledge that.
Under the Lima agreement, we had 1.8 billion in arrears we were supposed to deal with.
Yes.
We missed those targets, you agree?
Yes.
Right. So this is what Denford keeps referring to as legitimate. I think is the wrong
but
word.
he's saying $10 billion.
It's the issue of confidence. The lenders have no confidence. We agreed at Lima with the IMF that we will pay back. This is the schedule. Mm-hmm. We didn't meet those schedules.
That's true.
So there is no confidence. And when I think the financiers see the same actors resurrected again, who they lacked confidence in before.
This is where you are misinformed, because you have to understand why the arrangement was not fully paid back. Why we didn't implement it. The problem was the governance issue. At a very top level, where the president agreed, when Minister Chinamasa was in Lima, he called President Mugabe and told him that this is the arrangement that we have come up with and this is what we're going to do, and he agreed. When they went back, Comrade Mugabe then changed and said, no, we are not going to do that. But we have I agree, it's a lack of confidence, but now we have a new system. These international financiers are not stupid. They can see that there is a new person in charge. And I think they are willing to give him a chance to prove himself rather than judge him based on the past. We are all agreed that Comrade Mugabe, yes, he was our president, but he made a lot of mistakes, and those are the mistakes we are correcting. Why not give Comrade Mnangagwa a chance? He has only been president for 10 days, for God's sake.
Mnangagwa has been with Mugabe for 37 years.
But he was not president.
It doesn't matter. He's been his right-hand man for over 10 Mnangagwa and Mugabe have been this one and the same entity for a very long time, and there's no way you can tell me now, Frank, that he's a changed man.
Have you seen what he has done in the past 10 days?
But Dr. Johnson, what is surprising, which Dr. Guni must tell us, up until 10 November, the whole party was 100% behind Mugabe.
That's what
you endorsed him, you were ready at Congress, not only to endorse him as your sole candidate, and his wife as vice president.
No, that's not.
9 out of 10 it endorsed it. This is up to 10 November. What is the about 10? Is it showing that the party lacks any principles or scruples? They go with the wind, whoever is flavor of the month. This is what we are not understanding.
If that's your reading, then you.
Mnangagwa, when he was ousted, 9 out of 10 condemned him of the provinces. It is the
They were
West
forced to.
By
You saw what happened. No, I'm serious. I'm serious.
Condemned him is the worst.
I'm serious. Under President Mugabe, ZANU-PF largely operated on politics of patronage, and people were afraid. That's a fact. Not only was the opposition afraid, but people within ZANU-PF, they were afraid of the president and the powers she had amassed and arrogated unto herself. Nobody could speak ill. We had a vice president who was poisoned at a political rally.
He said he wasn't poisoned.
No, he just said it.
He keeps changing. We don't know.
Let me tell you. So I mean, but the bottom line is that's the past. Let's look towards the future. We can all work together to ensure that we have a well-developed, democratic, and prosperous Zimbabwe, rather than focus on criticizing what happened in 1980 or in 1987 or in 2008. We need to look forward.
It's still happening.
So let me ask John to just respond, and also perhaps give us a sense of what ZANU-PF is doing in South Africa, especially with the diaspora. Is there a movement to mobilize? Also, what are the concerns or issues of the diaspora? Of course, for my students and whatnot, there's a lot of Zimbabweans who live in South Africa now, right? Who have left all over, but certainly South Africa has been the beneficiary of many Zimbabweans who are educated, who have skills, who are hard workers, and who have actually contributed wonderfully to South Africa's economy. Give us, respond a little bit to what our colleagues here have said, and just give us a sense of what are the debates going on within ZANU-PF there in South Africa? Are the diaspora involved? Are they going back to vote next year? Oh, sorry, I was speaking that.
Well, it's correct to observe the large number of Africans that have left Zimbabwe, and many of them are here in South Africa. To give you an example, when I was there in 2003, I was working with a half a dozen lecturers in the computer science department. All of them at this point are either in South Africa or Botswana teaching. 5 out of the 6, all of the lecturers, one professor that remained there. But and they didn't leave because they were part of an opposition party. They left for economic reasons. They found that it was easier to work in South Africa and make money and send it back to their family. Where I'm now at Tshwane University of Technology, the head of my department in industrial engineering was from Zimbabwe. He now is a chair professor. And he came for economic reasons. He went to NUST as an undergraduate, and then came as a postgraduate student to South Africa, and stayed on for economic reasons. And I've had many friends here that are here for that reason. Now, the reality is that ZANU-PF is on the ground in South Africa. I've met with ZANU-PF. We work closely with the APRP. They work closely. And they have explained the situation in terms of the transition in Zimbabwe, and are looking forward to working with other Pan-Africanists, and they see this as a positive move in terms of the party reorganizing itself to fight against corruption and to move forward. And I think that those of us who are outside of ZANU-PF must respect the internal structures of the party in terms of the dynamics that have going on within it. And in terms of the major problem that exists is because of the thrust of capitalism and imperialism and the destabilization that is forced onto Zimbabwe and has created these other kinds of problems. Individuals who want to make individual gains either one, they need for opportunities outside, or they figure out some hustle if they can't get a regular job, regular situation going. And this is what is observed in terms of levels of corruption. It's a direct result of the type of impositions that are placed on the country by imperialism. And it's not new. This is the same kind of phenomenon that is taking place in other countries. We see destabilization attempts now in Venezuela and hyperinflation. Because Venezuela has stepped up to oppose imperialism similar to what has happened in Zimbabwe. I think we need to recognize these patterns, and while some people want to then claim that the Maduro government in Venezuela is problematic because they're listening to the misinformation on the kind of media that you get on CNN and Fox, we had the same kind of phenomena in the diaspora amongst our community, many who consider themselves progressive, who want to jump on a bandwagon of, well, Mugabe is 93, he should step down, he should pick a successor. This is the kind of misinformation and misdirection that we find both on this side of the ocean and on the other side of the ocean. ZANU-PF had the opportunity and the options to make a transition, and they made that decision. We should respect it and move forward. And the main issue for us, particularly those who are not Zimbabwe citizens, is to fight this destabilization attempt that's continued on the part of the EU and on the part of Britain and on the part of the US. This is a conscious effort because this is basically a unified effort on the part of successful settler colonialism in the US and to defend the rights of settlers in Zimbabwe. And it has a ripple effect. They don't want South Africa to take the land like Zimbabwe did. So they even hear the videos, oh, if you do that, you're going to end up like Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've run out of time, but I haven't had given the audience any opportunities to ask any questions. So I will just take two quick questions, and then we'll not hold you anymore. Any questions from the audience? I mean, I know we've said a lot, and our panelists have been great. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
When are you all going to interject high school students for this kind of exposure on a consistent basis, like starting in the fall?
Well, that's a question for the department and specifically for the center.
I've had a relationship with the department for 40 years plus.
Well, we have a center now which actually has a great, fantastic outreach program. These sometimes are not, it's not necessarily conducive to inviting high school students, to attend these.
I said for the fall.
First, let me respond. First, thank you for coming. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, and guests for your participation. First, you'll notice that this is being videotaped. We are going to make all of these videotapes available on our website. So for those high schoolers, other instructors in other countries, other universities will have access to this information. So we may not necessarily be able to duplicate this level of panel, but we will have this information available for others to view and to hear. We also have a very aggressive outreach program that's focused on K through 12. This kind of material is probably not the level of material that will be presented, but we have an ongoing program to continue to expose high schoolers, teachers particularly, because they don't have the material to be able to discuss it. And maybe really the issue is, as opposed to simply doing historic information, we need to be looking at how do we interject current information into the high school venue. Because I know right now most of the discussion, most of the instruction is really historic in nature and is not very contemporary. So that's something we can take back and look at and ask our outreach directors, and we can talk about. In fact, we'll be meeting on Monday And I'll bring up the idea of how do we interject contemporary information into our outreach.
Thank you. Dr. Zodi, did you have a question?
Yes, I'd like to.
I don't think those work, I'm afraid. We'll just-
Okay, I'll try to speak loud. So I really thank the panelists for this very informative discussion in a very civilized way. But I have a question for both, and I'm not partial to one party or another, but as an African, it always bothers me that a party in power always desires to stay in power. And the longer the party stay, the more they run out of new ideas. So what is really the perspective here on this idea that a party, it's in its interest to sometimes, step out of power and learn a few new things in the meantime. So I'm a little bit disturbed that the justification always is ZANU-PF is the only one who can do this. Can you reflect, is there at any point where you say there needs to be a change? And I think it's not a change in individuals we are looking at, but at least a collective group that will run a country. So what is your perspective from the ZANU-PF? I know the opposition would like to go in power, but they may behave just like you guys now, another 27 years. So what is your really perspective? How do you really understand power and responsibility to you people?
Well, that's a loaded question. I'll start by saying I think ZANU-PF at this moment in time understands that we have an inherent obligation to deliver to the people of Zimbabwe a prosperous Zimbabwe, a well-governed and democratic Zimbabwe for everyone, not just for members of ZANU-PF. But going back to your fundamental question, should we step out of power and learn a few things while others are running? Well, there is no political party in the world that deliberately wants to vote itself out. The whole purpose of having a structured political system where you have a political power campaigning to be in power is to ensure that they continue to govern according to their own political beliefs. But Zimbabwe is a democratic country. We go back to constitutionalism. We want to ensure that the level playing field, so the playing field is leveled, so that everyone from the opposition or even independent people can have the same opportunities as we do. We just believe that we are well organized and we are more entrenched into the people, and we can sell our message better. That's why people keep voting us. The biggest challenge we have had is that within our own internal system, there have been questions of whether we are adhering to the fundamental principles that are provided for within our own party constitution and the national constitution. And I think as long as we are ensuring that the playing field is level, the process is democratic, free and fair, then if we get voted back like we want to, I think it's a fair system.
I think that's a very poignant question that you posed. What we see in most cases, especially in Africa, is that when people come into power, they come in for nefarious reasons. Most of them, they end up either looting the country's resources, and then it becomes extremely difficult to abdicate and give somebody else a chance, because most of them end up in jail. And so to avoid that, they'd rather stay in power in perpetuity. What we're seeing in ZANU-PF is that all of a sudden, it's taken them 37 years to realize that there was something wrong with their president, there was something wrong with their party. The 37 years when they were looting the country's resources, everything was hunky-dory. But now all of a sudden, because one of their own has been fired, they suddenly realize that something is wrong with their party, it needs to be reformed. I think what happened, what I can say was a positive for the GNU, which ushered in the new constitution in our country, is the fact that there are term limits now for the first time in our constitution. So whoever goes in as president now knows that they can only run for 2 terms. And there's uncertainty if the military has the power to act constitutionally to remove whatever president, then we are back at its mercy again.
They didn't remove the president.
The president was removed.
No, he resigned.
Oh, okay.
Yes, he was under impeachment by parliament, not by the army.
The president was getting ready for next year's elections, and then he had been endorsed.
John, thank you very much for chiming in and participating at the last minute. I really appreciate it. I wish you the best of luck, and hopefully we'll continue to be in touch, because your insights will be will be helpful.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm always looking this way.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson.
I think we should. Let me get one last question, and then we should probably wrap it up. Okay, 2 last questions.
I think it's 3. There's another one in the back.
Because it's in 4, then it's 5. There we go.
Now is the opposition.
Okay, yes. Sir, in the red hat, and then I'll go to Wheeler.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Well, mine is very simple. I mean, I know these gentlemen.
You know these characters.
Oh, yeah. We know them, so I just wanted him to clarify which constitution Zimbabwe is currently using, whether the old constitution or the new constitution, because if in essence we're not going to have diaspora vote, it means that then we're still using the old constitution, because if we're moving to the new constitution, then we have to follow the laws exactly as they are, written in the new constitution. Because I still believe that the government can actually put a lot of time and money if they really want the diaspora to all vote. Because if they are upholding the law, they have to put an effort to make sure that 5 million of the Zimbabweans in the diaspora are not disenfranchised.
Well, I agreed. Let me quickly answer that. It's a very simple question for us. Because again, we have to go back to the law. We are operating under the 2013 constitution, which is the new constitution. However, to run an election, you don't run an election with the constitution. We run an election with the an electoral law. The electoral law that is in existence today is an old electoral law which must be realigned into the new constitution. This is what's happening as introduced today. That process doesn't happen in one day. It's a process that takes up a minimum of 3 months. Okay, for the realignment to be completed and for the president to assent to that bill. By that time, you will have 3 months left before the elections. And all I'm saying is, from my personal perspective, I don't see the practicability of the government making available funds and registration process of the 3 or 4 million people outside of Zimbabwe within 3 months and make sure that they are enabled to vote. But the fundamental thing is, once it's realigned, everybody will have legal rights to vote. As a stopgap measure, the government of Zimbabwe has already said everyone in the diaspora is welcome to go back and register and vote. But I understand that there are some people that can't. Unfortunately, from my personal perspective, I don't foresee them being able to vote next year.
So then would you think that it is maybe okay for the government of Zimbabwe to be able to amend this new constitution to be able to allow the 5 million Zimbabweans in the diaspora to vote, and possibly think of maybe postponing the election, because we want to be able to have all Zimbabweans involved in this dispensation? Don't you think it's a much...
You can't just postpone elections for that. You must have legal reasons for that. And right now, there isn't any legal reason.
The enfranchisement of Zimbabweans, I think, is a very good thing.
I think I've answered that question.
No, the financial constraints, so-called, that you are mentioning are just a red herring. Because
what do you mean? There's no
the UNDP...
You just said the government is broke.
No, the UNDP has stepped up because we've approached them several times. They are willing to fund these elections as of yesterday. They have been willing. We have shown a blueprint to the government, and the government, just like with the BVR kits, that the UN had offered to purchase. The government stepped in last minute and said, oh well, we think we don't want the UN money now. Why? Because they want total control of the BVR kits so that they can manipulate them. Again, we go back to the manipulation of the electoral process, even the voter registration. The UNGP has the money. You and I can go to the United Nations tomorrow and they will tell you that we have the money for the diaspora vote.
The diaspora vote has to be registered. And after being registered, you have to verify those registrations and then put in place a
mechanism. That can be done within 3 months.
Well, I don't think that's practical.
Yes, we have a blueprint that says that can be done in 3 months.
Well, that's your thinking. You're entitled to it. But I can tell you what is practical.
I think what's interesting on this diaspora vote, I wonder if the opposition is not making too much out of it. Our current vote, I think it's 30-something% turn up to vote at home.
Yes.
There is a huge swath of youths right there in Zimbabwe who they don't reach, who don't vote. I said 77% of our population is under 35, they don't vote. So I think the opposition is chasing this thing. It reminds me of this Russia thing here. Chasing this thing, and ignoring what are real pickings at home. Yes. They should be rejuvenating themselves, because also they have an image issue at home. Rejuvenate themselves and appeal to the youth and stop what. There is no guarantee that diaspora will vote for. I think they are taking it for granted. It's not true. Some of us feel the opposition leader is a failed project. We will not vote for him. So they mustn't make this assumption either. That just because it's diaspora, it's 99%. I heard Denford say is opposition. No.
The voter apathy we see on our youth in Zimbabwe is that for the past 5 or so elections, it has been clear on the ground who the winner has been, and those voters have been stolen. That can discourage anyone to continue doing the same thing, hoping for a different result. What our youth now want to do is to demand the electoral reforms and make sure that the vote is protected,
which we are doing.
You are good on saying you will do things, but you don't do them. Mugabe promised the same youth 2 million jobs in 2013, the same youth, and now three years from that,
the reforms were introduced in parliament today.
Yeah, but ZANU-PF is very good at saying we are going to do this, and they never follow through. I'm giving you an example of Mugabe promising 2 million jobs in 2013 so he could lure votes. What happened? Instead we have 4 million vendors.
So why don't you use that to campaign against us and win? Why don't you use that?
As long as there are no electoral reforms.
They've just been introduced for the 10th time. They've been introduced today. What more reforms do you want?
Let me get to our last question because we're 30 minutes over.
Sorry.
Okay, again, thank you, gentlemen. I'm just wondering if the real reason this is a major problem is not being addressed, and that's that there are few ways for the average person to gain wealth other than through politics. And so either they get in politics and they steal, or give or steer resources to their friends. And the real issue is that those who really are looking to make an honest living, they usually leave. They go to South Africa. They go to America. And so until Africa, and so you have the scramble for the high office. Mm-hmm. You see it in Liberia, you see it in Kenya, you see it in Gambia, because that's the way to wealth. That's the way to prosperity, as opposed to developing the economy.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to developing the economy so that people can have another way of prosperity, as opposed to through the politics. And as opposed to and if the politics doesn't work, they take to the bullet, they take to the gun. So they, either you're going to get in politics by the bullet or by the gun, but that's the way of wealth, and so that's the way people have been going. So if we could look at the issue, is that the average person, the populace, does not have a way of making a living, a way of sustaining themselves. then we're going to continue to have this fight. We're going to continue to, fight for the presidency as opposed to fight for the people. Let's have economic development. Let's develop the country. So I'm just curious that aside from these, who's president, and yeah, okay, but what about the president? What about the country development? What about bringing in ministers and people who can really help develop the country? Is that the real problem, as opposed to my guy is in, therefore all my friends and my family will get what they want?
Well, let me, I think that's kind of a good point to end.
Yes.
Doom, 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 to be continued, because we certainly need to bring you back and to continue the conversation. I mean, in the next 6 months are going to be really, absolutely, they're going to be very critical for Zimbabwe, and it would be wonderful to have you back to continue this conversation and debate, and kind of see where we are in a few months' time, and then see what directions we're moving in. I want to thank you all, really, again, for a lively discussion and debate. It's been very, very, I know, educational and illuminating for our students and for us, and I really thank you very much for coming to Howard and to participating, especially on such short notice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.